Today we are talking about Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Now, this is very rooted in the original culture, and it really is tied up in the way that Jewish people owned and dealt with slaves. So the society there was incredibly stratified, with the priests and the people, the rulers in the temple occupying the kind of highest level, and slaves occupying the lowest level. There were really two classes of slaves, and there were Jewish slaves and there were Gentile slaves. Now, Jewish slaves had a really kind of particular existence. First off, they became slaves only by selling themselves into slavery, or in rare cases by their family selling them into slavery, because they had some sort of debt that they couldn't pay back. And when that happened, then the solution was, well, I'll kind of work it off. Jewish slaves weren't slaves for a lifetime. As a matter of fact, once every 50 years, there was something called the Year of Jubilee. All those Jewish slaves would be freed. And so the value of a slave, when somebody sold themselves into slavery, it was set partly based on how many years that they had left to serve before they had to be freed. And when you were a Jewish slave, it was hard. It was a hard life, don't get me wrong, but there were some protections. You were not allowed to be overworked, for example. You were not allowed to have a Jewish slave do anything that would make themselves ritualistically unclean. You were not allowed to have a Jewish slave wash people's feet. And if it happened that you found a long-lost relative or inherited a lot of money, a Jewish slave could actually buy themselves out of slavery for a prorated amount based on the original purchase price minus the years that had already been served. It wasn't so great. It wasn't such a great situation for Gentile slaves. They were the lowest rung. So the very bottom of society, above the outcasts and the people who were, begging on the street, were the Gentile slaves. Gentile slaves were protected from being abused, but that was basically it. The Gentile slaves would have to do the jobs that would make someone ritualistically unclean. And probably the most common job, one of the things that they were doing all the time, was washing people's feet. Washing somebody's feet was really difficult. This culture wore open sandals. They were in a desert climate, so we're talking about dusty, dirty roads. Your feet would get filthy just walking to the neighbor's house. So the real question is, why was washing feet such a big deal that only Gentiles could do it? And why was it involved in things? Well, partly it's the way that they ate. So sometimes we have this thing that we do when we read the Bible. We can forget that it didn't happen in 21st century America, and we think of Jesus and the disciples hanging out on lazy boys and eating at the sort of tables that we have in our dining room. That's not how it happened. That's not how they ate, especially. They ate in a reclining posture on their side, or sometimes even on their stomach and leaning on one arm. And the way that the tables were set up is you would be kind of reclining, and then the table would be right there at the same level that you were reclining. And that meant that your feet were on the same plane as the food. So, in America, we tell our kids to go and wash your hands before you come to dinner. Well, in first century Israel, you would say, wash your hands and wash your feet before you come to dinner, because we don't want what is on the ground in the dust and dirt in first century Israel in our food. And so it was a kind of an imperative just for cleanliness, for there to be foot washing, especially when there's gatherings of people. And all of that serves as a background to this really profound moment in the life of the disciples with Jesus.